promoting pluralism in science fiction, the USSR's top leadership, and the fall of the state. All of these words are keywords here. The pluralism itself, a specific type of pluralism, not any kind of pluralism, but Western pluralism is the one. Top leadership, by top leadership, I mean the Politburo, the political bureaucracy in the Soviet Union. Just a few people, okay, well, a dozen of people, 12 people, who decided the entire ideology of the USSR, trying to brainwash or whitewash the Soviet regime. That's the people who reform and introduce a different way of thinking. And also the fall of the state, that actually because of their actions, or maybe because they tried to counter these actions, the fall of the state happened. First, I'll start with the methodology, because I believe that methodology is the message. The way you treat a problem, an object, would define where you go with that. So my approach was digital humanities. I really wanted to create databases with mappings and network analysis. And that's where I encountered, let's say, certain hostility in the field. Right? Digital humanities is a rival to traditional literary humanities. And I got a request to actually make it linear literary studies, where you follow citations, where you follow traditional path of analysis, right? When you don't show graphs, when you don't show maps or networks, but you basically just can say what's happening without a picture, without an image. And that's why I had to do certain transformations with the initial research that I had to transform it into a traditional writing that fits into a standard literary dissertation without digital humanities. So when I had my prospectus, I basically created a database of all the science fiction writers that I felt were really interesting to investigate. I created a database of, as I remember, 500 writers that were translated into the Russian language, because I specifically wanted to look into the Russian language, the language itself, not the origin of the writer, but the language that made people read these ideas. And as I went through these databases and where these people were, I was trying to find the keywords that make them similar, right? And I realized that actually there is something there, right? There's this keyword pluralism, diversity, that stand out. There are some authors that use it in a specific way, while the majority just misses it out completely. So I started collecting specifically Russian, Polish, and Ukrainian science fiction, looking for these keywords like pluralism, futurology, individualism, and so forth. And I immediately realized that there are two texts, surprisingly, very similar in how they speak. They use the same keywords that are very sharply defined. And these were a member of the Politburo, one of 12, and a science fiction writer from Poland, Stanislav Lem, who also was known for promoting scientific theories in science fiction. And Stanislav Lem, unlike many other Western pluralists, was allowed in the Soviet Union because he was entertainment. So the problem with this analysis, when you encounter science fiction and you want to apply any kind of methodology to it, is that there is some kind of border that we need to assess. Is it a real border between cultures, or is it just a constructed border in literary sciences? Because if you get into science fiction writings, they're very political, ideological, and they have the binary, right? That there's American European sci-fi and Soviet Russian sci-fi. So American sci-fi usually looks like this, and it usually follows three topics. Machine revolt, right? So humans create exactly what kills them. Two cultures contact, and then exploration of either colonization or possible mutual agreement, and then that humans are pre-programmed, they're robots themselves, and then they don't have agency anymore, right? So these are three main topics. Yes, they are not, it's not like this in Soviet science fiction by definition, because Soviet art in general has to elevate the spirits. It has to teach you how to get out of a deadlock. That's why it cannot be like this. And it's not about humans and their creations, but it's about ideologies. So this is a film that Coppola bought from the Soviet Union, and he made an important change in this film, that he totally eliminated the binary between the Soviets and the US, and replaced it with two monsters in space fighting with each other, one monster representing male genitalia and the other female genitalia. That's the biggest difference between two classes of science fiction. This one is about politics, and American is more about self-exploration, right? And this is a huge pillar here, right? The distinction. And these two, for instance, are about a boy flying to the moon where he discovers capitalism and how it enslaves people. Okay, so it's all political. You just cannot escape a political fairy tale. My primary text research grounded on a Polish writer. It's really hard to say who he really is. He was from Ukraine, Lviv, but back then Ukraine was controlled temporarily by Poland, so he spoke Polish, but he was Jewish. So he never integrated in any society, and when the Soviet Union introduced the curfew to repress the entire population in 1981, he ran away to Austria and started studying Nazism there and interacting with top philosophers. So now there's a huge German language studies of Lamb in his political science, because he became a political scientist when he emigrated. All of these books that he wrote explore similar themes with the same discourse. And in a second you'll see that these words will circulate, like repetition. So there's always choice between repeating history and doing something else. And there is no compulsory need to repeat. We can do something else right away, even in mundane things. There's fiasco, right, that we always plan, but we cannot achieve what we plan. So there's always this fiasco. We have to be aware of this. We have to be self-critical and understand that planning doesn't mean achieving. And peace on earth, right? That it was so hard to achieve peace on earth that the only thing that people could do, and this is the book of 1986, they could invent robots that would fight for their national interest on the moon. Just drones fighting drones, kind of making it less morally deprecating. So the background studies, right? We always need background studies to understand at least where we are. So where are we? We are here. The period that I study is 1980s, right? That's the period when two big states fall apart in Europe: Yugoslavia, the Slavic southern state, and the Soviet Union, right? That had 16 republics all over the Eurasia, right? The entire continent. And it falls apart. And you see, it's called Eastern Bloc. It means that these countries, including these countries and these countries, right, they have the same ideology that is universalist, socialist, and it's based on certain ideology. But the thing is, it's not only that this bloc is united by this ideology, is that this bloc is united by opposing this ideology. So once this ideology disappears, it creates crisis globally. For everybody, not only those who follow these ideas, but also those who oppose these ideas, and these ideas are no longer relevant. So, if we look at the map of Europe, right, in the 80s and on the break of 2 decades, we'll see that here we have 7 countries. Here we have the Parade of Independence, and if resolution was better, we would see that Russia exits the Soviet Union somewhere here. It's not the last country to exit the Soviet Union. And also we can notice that the Soviet Union legally approves sovereign states. It's not the other countries approve it, but the Soviet Union. So, on the brink of these 2 decades, we have identity and ideology crisis. It's identity crisis because it's a huge question whether you associate yourself with capitalism and communism. And if we live in the world of the end of history, Fukuyama, futurology, right, this discourses, then it means that there is nothing else to capitalism, so we don't even care about it anymore. So that's identity crisis. Do we care? Is there a difference in ideology? If there is no communism, then there is this capitalism, and only diversity within this ideology can appear. So it's kind of a world crisis because people don't know who they are and what they're doing, where they're going. And this is one of these books by the Politburo that reformed the Soviet state. It says where we're going, where the humanity is going. That's the question what they ask. They really need to understand, because if society does not support socialism anymore, they're going a different direction. And I argue that Politburo, the political bureaucracy, these people who were supposed to organize the society ideologically, were the problem. They were the problem. They inflated the terms like democracy, solidarity, they on purpose, right? They always wanted to show that there's socialist democracy in Cuba, but there's no democracy in the US. So they constantly play with these terms to make them irrelevant. Also, of course, they brainwash with their journals that present as if they're scientific journals. These are scholarly political science journals that you can find at any library in the US. They are produced straight by the head of the KGB and his little crew of the Politburo, okay? Specifically to teach you how they want you to think about it. And if you start speaking their language, you have to find the common ground, and it means you need to translate and so forth, right? But this is intentionally created to confuse. And of course, the problem was that although they had so much soft power and they were controlling all the media, they still had to use tanks all the time. Right? Like, it just didn't work. And the guy who organized this was also the head of the KGB, of the intelligence, and he's like, okay, tanks then. And he was exactly in Czechoslovakia in 1986 to witness how the tanks entered because he failed with his propaganda. A lot of people believe that this was a turning point for the propagandists, for the Politburo themselves, who was stationed in Czechoslovakia, and they were like, okay, if it doesn't work, if they hate us, so probably something is wrong. We cannot believe them ourselves in what we are promoting. So one of the Politburo members, and there were two of them, started basically institutionally promoting Western pluralism. He created an organization which was provocatively called the Institute of Political Sciences, right? So, because in the Soviet Union they believe that Marxism-Leninism is a science and everything else is just like propaganda. And suddenly everything is actually an ideology, and he writes specifically a book that then they translate in 2 years by the top ideological publishing house, Progress, and send it to, of course, every place. I could buy that Strand for $10. Maybe you also can. I think there are multiple copies. So that's what the Politburo, that's what propaganda promotes. So he writes a critical study of non-Marxist concepts of how society develops, basically promoting pluralism, making the last chapter, the supplement, a science fiction short story, where he retells exactly what he wanted to say, but now in science fiction, because he's also a science fiction theorist and science fiction writer, and also one of 12 Politburo members. Okay, so that's 1979. It's pretty early. There is no change in the air. They just do it in case they need it. Or maybe they do it because they want to communicate with Western politicians in their language, but pretend that they share this language somehow, right? So maybe he's just an ambassador of a small group, a small clique of ideologies. It becomes evident when you look into what this Politburo member and his colleague Eduard Arabogli, right, use. They actually refer same novels all over again. Right? First, Stanislav Lem's Summa Technologiae that talks about cybernetics and specifically says that humans will always be stupider than their creations. So we have to remember that. So it comes with this Western idea that machines can revolt, that humans can be machines themselves if they're enslaved by the technology. Very critical of technology because it comes from cybernetics, and the father of cybernetics, Norbert Wiener. He writes that computers will be created to control people by people, and we need to make sure that computers will not be an ethical device to do it. Okay, so it's 1956. People already know that we'll be controlled by computers. 1984, right, doesn't need introduction, and Fahrenheit 451, where books are burned to protect people from knowing, right? So these are the novels that they constantly talk about, but there is something they never mention, and actually this book has never been translated into Russian completely, and it's not in English. There is no English translation of this book, but this is the book that finds this shift, that is so important for this shift from totalitarian ideology to post-ideology in the Soviet Union. This book, the two volumes, they come apart in 2 years, 1970, where Stanislav Lem first formulates the problem of how can you use science fiction to promote social advance, like in the Soviet Union, but without Soviet ideology, right? So how can you have this potentially positive impact on humanity if you use entertainment? And here he answers his question. He does a throughout study, and he says, okay, so like 100 years ago, there was a British novelist who wrote a very short story. That's exactly what I want to make my main of life. I'll be replicating this idea. And the whole idea is that there is multiverse, so there is universe and multiverse. We live in multiverse. So you think that you can summarize, generalize life and humanity? You can't, right? Because people live in different universes. And this idea then becomes one of the structural tropes of thinking about diversity, right? We cannot have a universal, homogenized world because we live in a multiverse, yeah? And so that's the birth of this idea in 1972. And most likely, Shachnazarov reads it in Polish because he speaks Czech and lives in Czechoslovakia, right? Czech language is very close to Polish language. So with my study, as I explored these connections, I argued that the discourse of futurology is the one that embedded the transition stage from internationalist, universal, socialist identities and ideologies towards undefined space for anything, unprecedented, and what is important, local. Something that cannot be universal, something that you can find in one place. So this internal socialist power structure mostly was held by the control of media. So any journalist that speaks out or anyone just a dissident speaking out should be repressed physically. That's the main way to control society. But there was also soft power, for instance, spreading fake news, like creating confusion among the rivals. It's enough, right? So you either terrorize, confuse, or you actually accuse, so shame, guilt-tripping. And for that they have their fake discourse of democracy, saying that we have democracy, you have autocracy. We have freedom, you have unfreedom. We have, and so forth, right? So that's how they kind of control this huge territory. Violence, confusion, shame. The transition that happens during Perestroika, 1986-1991, is that first, they really doubt how to use the word pluralism. So the Politburo members come in and tell Gorbachev, the head of the state, that, look, you need to use pluralism because this is going to be very attractive to our Western partners. He's like, okay, this is going to be socialist pluralism, meaning that we are different here in the party. And everyone started scratching head. Do we differ in this party? We never thought of this. We should have been like one united force, right? The party, the people. There can be no socialist pluralism as such. Socialism is like a defined idea. But of course, there were critics saying that, but you look, there's Chinese socialism, Yugoslavian socialism, right? So these are different socialism. That was a huge problem. Also, there was Eurocommunism. So people in Europe who believed in communism, but they never were associated with the Communist Party. And the KGB really wanted to do physical harm to them. You can find, Mitrokhin archive where they really tried to kill most of them, like Louis Althusser, a famous philosopher. They were like after them because they didn't like that someone represents communism. So socialist pluralism was a huge step. And until now, there is now not really throughout study of that, but the pro-Kremlin scholars argue that the socialist was dropped 2 days before the Soviet Union collapsed. So as the socialist disappears from discourse, the Soviet Union disappears as well. Yeah, it's the union of socialist Soviet republics, right? So socialist disappears, Soviet disappears, and everything else disappears as well. Ideological unity as the concept stops being valuable, it actually starts being the opposite. Yeah, unity is bad. Socialist identity becomes obsolete, right? Because there is no socialist pluralism anymore. And planned economy becomes obsolete because, well, everybody jokes that that's exactly the problem why the Soviet Union is so bad. It's like they believe that economy is superior, but it never worked. So the main agents behind this transition. So Andrei Sakharov in 1968, right, to respond to Czechoslovakian invasion, right, that moment of identity crisis, he writes on progress, where he uses the word pluralism, futurology, mutual disarmament, peaceful cohabitation. So all of these terms that Lem already used, and then that became mainstream during the last stages of Soviet Union collapse. Right? This is the guy who in 1968, as a dissident, already declares the discourse of power. But probably you know that Andrei Sakharov was the creator of the bomb, right? The term bomb, and he used this position to counter Soviet ideologies in the 60s. He was jailed. He spent 10 years in jail in a secret city with no reference to him. He never existed. And that's the first person who was freed during Perestroika. And that's the person who presented in 1989 in the front of the parliament, saying that we need pluralism, we need futurology, we need to understand that the planned economy will never save us. We are in crisis, and that's the normal state of being. So they boo him. But Gorbachev says, keep going. And he dies just within a week after that performance. That's his last live performance, but it's impactful. And he also was the founder of Amnesty International in 1974, right? So the processes are institutionalized. Then this is Georgy Shakhnazarov and Mikhail Gorbachev. Georgy Shakhnazarov and Mikhail Gorbachev spent a lot of time, 20 years together. Gorbachev was actually the head of the KGB's Discipol. That's why the Soviet Union chose this person over the other. When during autocracy died out, they were like, he's young, but he's from the KGB. Yeah? And Gorbachev was actually like a KGB guy at first. He was like, we have terrible economy because there's no enthusiasm. We are all alcoholics, like people who are not working enough, they go to jail. All of the plantations with wine were crushed down, right? So that was the approach. But then Chernobyl exploded. They tried to hide it, and within 2 weeks they realized that something needs to change, right? They need to gain credibility again while they couldn't. And Georgy Shakhnazarov is exactly the guy who used science fiction to make it so appealing to the masses. As a writer, as a theorist, and also, of course, as one of 12 ideologists of the Soviet Union. Stanisław Lem is a Polish Jewish writer, right, who spent most of his time studying cybernetics and political science. His favorite philosopher to argue with was Paul Feyerabend, who founded his studies on Karl Popper. Yeah, Karl Popper, a famous social scientist who argued that science should become agnostic, that science will never give you truth. It's very relevant, and only relativism can bring us knowledge. Otherwise, we end up with fundamentalism. If you believe in anything, it's fundamentalism. So Ariadne Gromov was a critic who noticed a text by Stanisław Lem in 1962, pretty early on, and taught other Soviet writers how to do it. So it's no longer about these Soviets saving the world from the Americans, but it's about the internal exploration, and it happens right away after she translates this text from Polish. Okay, so she teaches them, and there's a specific moment, a seminar where she gives a talk, and everybody's like, we're so moved by this idea that there is something that is not human, that can impact humanity, and it really delivers this message that there is something beyond science, right? We always have to go back to these humanities studies to capture what contemporary science would not be able to do. That's why we need literature. That's why we need science fiction, right? Fiction. We're stepping towards something that science is unable to produce because of its limitation. So now the chief, I want to show now how this transition happens. So the chief features of Soviet ideological language were that Soviet ideological language is scientific. It escalates any kind of knowledge to revolutionary rhetoric. So what we know is revolutionary, what you know is not revolutionary, it's just outdated. And it creates the distinction between the West and the USSR. And this distinction is naturalized, essentialized as bourgeois versus Soviet science. There is Soviet science and there is Western science. And this is the ideological difference that you can find in human and nature sciences. For instance, in social sciences, the idea that American social sciences, they always emphasize rivalry and conflict, but we, the Soviets, will talk about cooperation. You can see this actually in one experiment that they did in the Black Sea when they tried to put the species into the Black Sea because they thought it's going to improve the ecology. In reality, the species just ate out all other species and created an ecological disaster, right? So because they thought that cooperation will help, but rivalry also exists. So that's one thing, right? They think that what they know is revolutionary, and it has different knowledge about human and nature in general. Also, class conflict is a scientific concept, and I usually ask my students, what are social categorizations? They never mention class, never. And then class, what is this, right? But for a Soviet person, This is like a term they know from childhood. Class, class, class. You belong to this class, you belong to that class. So, class, right? And then Marxism-Leninism is a scientific theory, right? It's not just an ideology, a faith, but it's a scientific theory. Everybody has to have the same idea. Well, humans are universal, so what we can do here, we can do anywhere, right? It doesn't matter what people's religion is, background, age, whatever. No, we can export our ideology and make all the world socialist, capitalist, whatever, right? So that's the idea. And of course, the last thing is that there's a concept of laws of history. It comes from Karl Marx and Engels and common economy. Because there are laws of history, we can command laws of history and build economy not based on interactions, but based on calculations, right? That's this kind of law idea. The chief changes happen to the following ideas. Humans are not universal. Humans are different, and we have to start there, our sociological theories. There is no universal human. There are no laws of history. If something happened in the past, it doesn't mean that it has to repeat. Repetition, once again, is a political choice. It's a conservative choice. There is no class and race. And actually, Georgy Shakhnazarov, the pluralist science fiction writer that I explore here, the Politburo member, he says that class and race are the same ideas, the same as, he shows this in his science fiction of 1984, before Perestroika, that class and race are just the theories of exploitation. The powerful ones implemented as science to put people in a specific place in society. So it's a theory of exploitation rather than theory of exploration. And class and race are the same things to him. It's like clan. Yeah, that's what he shows in his science fiction. Ideological conflict is fine, right? So the Soviet Union runs on the idea that there is one party, that's why we are so united, that we are more progressive now. The Politburo member comes out and says, no, actually, there's always a conflict, we have to explore it, it's fine, and that's what moves us. Knowledge changes, right? So the idea is that there can be no Karl Marx just teaching us what to do 150 years after that, right? Without revisiting his ideas and looking into how it adjusts to the contemporary era. So Marxism-Leninism is outdated. That's what they say. That's what they start saying from 1979. Marxism-Leninism just doesn't fit what we experience right away with our economy. There must be doubt and not blind faith. So all Soviet science and of course political expression is revolutionary, right? We know what we do, we just move forward, we achieve communism, that's the purpose of life. Now we're in the situation of relativism, constant doubt, agnosticism, or even skepticism, right? So whatever the idea is, we first are ambivalent about it. And the last thing is, and it kind of explains how we actually can do these changes, is that there must be a change in how we talk to each other. And that's what Gorbachev and his Politburo demonstrates on cameras, that they have these kind of discussions, but then they're very polite and they can close them and kind of freeze these differences, right? That they don't have to come to final decision in these polemics, that it's just ongoing. And they show it, they write about these memoirs, they show it on TV. Gorbachev himself goes to crowds of people who start arguing with him and he responds to them, right? So the idea is that argument becomes very normal and it's unique. Okay? And with these ideas, right, to reform from a very rigid mindset to doubtful, ambiguous view on the world, there are certain tropes, certain figures of speech. So instead of starting our conversation with let's all be pluralists, let's forget that Marxism-Leninism is improper, or class theory is wrong. Like, let's not talk about this. Let's talk about fairy tales and fiction, science fiction. Let's talk about the same thing, but with our pictures in mind. Okay, so these pictures would be parallel realities, coexisting at the same time. So this is multiverse, right? If you live in the world where there are multiple realities with different rules and laws, that means that there can be no universal human, no universal law of history, and the possibility for local change, for local innovation. Unknown natural phenomena, That's the challenge for scientific knowledge, right? If we don't know exactly how quantum physics work, we still believe it's a metaphysical idea, then we shouldn't be so keen to just rely on it, right? We just have to, we may expect that something unprecedented will still be explored. Environmental impact is very important, so again, local change. Even if you have good ideas, good technology, if you put it in the social environment that has different values, it's going to adjust it. So there's nothing universal about technology, humans, and development. Martians among us. So the idea is that the parallel universes are not only separate from us, but also people from other universes, they live with us, right? So we just need to acknowledge that we may be Martians. So Yuri Shakhnazarov writes in 1986, when the perestroika starts, a short story, Martian, where he tells a story about a guy who walks around and everybody tells him that, there's a Martian among us. We don't know who he is. And he then basically meets some politically aware person, and that person tells him, stop talking about this because you may be the Martian. Yeah? So we may be Martians too. And the parallel incomprehensible logic, right? So there are some systems or non-human objects, computers, maybe monsters that have different logic, and we can never say that there is one universal logic. So when someone says it doesn't make sense, it only doesn't make sense in their logic, in their universe, in their environment, but it can make sense somewhere else. And that was really important because, once again, Marxism, Leninism, and Soviet science, they rely on the idea that logic is universal, science is universal, and everyone else is just wrong. So case studies. I'll just take 5 minutes here. So Stanislav Lem, he invents Solaris pretty early, 1962, and the idea of Solaris is that it's a planet, or maybe an ocean, we don't really know. The description looks like the cell under the microscope, and so people travel to space to explore this planet, ocean, mind, and this mind just starts mimicking their own thoughts and giving them their forbidden desires. And because people cannot stop following the temptation, they ruin themselves and they choose to live in a fantasy instead of living in the real world. This story created a lot of insights in society, right? So this is something non-human, new for science, that changes our psychology, but also it's an allegory, right? It's like social media can be this, or science itself, or other people, or just institutions. So it's just a productive allegory of influence. Right, these are all portrayals of this kind of mind-changing non-human that Stanislav Lem introduced into science fiction. And Solaris can also be interpreted as social context, right, that people choose. So it's either, political leaders, soul partners, family, school that are these Solaris, right, this non-human, non-me that changes me psychologically, or maybe these are new technologies or substances or viruses or just threats from space. All of this isn't that novel. All of that is mentioned, right? And it's important to say that Stanislav Lem was himself a biologist and his father was a surgeon, so for him it was the most natural way to talk about science. So he introduces the term metagalactically plural reason, and I should say that actual political scientists and science fiction theorists noticed that already in 1989, right? So I was luckily not the first one to start talking about this. And this is a citation of a study where they mention exactly the book that I showed you that is not translated into English and not translated into Russian. It's called Fantasy and Futurology from Stanislav Lem, right? So that's the book that they used to reform the Soviet state. Then another one, and I'll be galloping here. So Volodymyr Savchenko from Ukraine, who becomes highly successful with his Soviet novel Self-Discovery, which is again about this kind of Solaris that one's discovered in the technology that one creates. That that people are weaker than what they create. And then at the end of this of his life, he unites with a dissident Ukrainian science fiction writer, basically to claim that Chernobyl might have exploded not because of a mistake, but maybe because we don't know nuclear physics, and just the atom itself, it just expanded and exploded. Of course, it was a joke and, of course, a very satirical one, but the idea was such that, again, relativism, we don't know anything, science is false, and destabilizing faith in science was more important than delivering proper content. He had similar ideas in his last novel, The Rank in the Universe, very similar to this Solaris, that humans discover some kind of pseudo-planet that flies into Earth and it impacts their well-being. They don't know what to do, and of course they decide to bombard it with nuclear weapons. It's very typical for science fiction, right? So when they are faced with something new and unique, they decide to just try to destroy it. This becomes like a very important trope for the entire generation of a leader who destroys his own creation for the benefit of society. Yeah? He links it to early Soviet utopia of 1956, of de-Stalinization, Yefremov, and also, just like showing that a proper leader is not only the leader who wants the win by any means. Okay, and the last example is the Strugatsky brothers, very famous Russian writers of Jewish descent. There were many ways to explore them with new identities and ideologies after the Soviet Union collapsed, because they never spoke of themselves as Jewish. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, they finally could. One brother survived, and he started talking about himself as Jewish. And so there's entire Israeli Jewish studies in the Strugatsky brothers, because a new identity was explored, and finally they started seeing it in their science fiction of the 60s and 70s, right? But I wanted to point to this kind of another Solaris, another unknown in nature. They come to the idea of the forest, that is this kind of Solaris, and in this forest, because women figure out how to use actually this secretive substance, right, this forest, they are able to reproduce themselves without men. The problem was that men, they're drunk all the time, they're aggressive, and they cannot talk, so they run away. They can reproduce themselves, they create robots to kidnap women, but actually not to kidnap them, to free them. And the entire story is that actually the male protagonist who witnesses this, and who first is rejected but then is accepted, he says, I hate these ugly women, I cannot stand it, I better die as a stupid man, right? So, and of course they were joking. It's a satirical response to that. But they still show this kind of, newness. If you're a relativist, there is a chance that you can explore new society, right? You don't have to think that there's only socialist or capitalism. And so I wanted to end here the note, right, with the topic. The topic is the USSR stop leadership and the fall of the Soviet state. So yes, they try to be very democratic in how they reform the state. So Gorbachev introduced a new post of the president. They wanted to have the elections, but they realized it's not going to work. So they had to change it to like pseudo-elections with the parliament. And the parliament, of course, was like a Soviet parliament, so it was non-functional. It had 4,000 people who have to say something. And as they gather this parliament to make their like pseudo-democratic elections, they have 3 candidates, and everybody just comes to the microphone, and they can nominate themselves, but they say, we all want Gorbachev, all 4,000 people. Maybe like one person voted for himself, Ryzhkov, but everyone votes for him. And the Politburo, who planned all this, they're in despair. In their diaries, they spent like hundreds of pages just saying how disappointed they were because of that. That they could not make people just get power. They didn't want it. Because, of course, the deputies had their own stance in society, so why would they give it up? And so the Politburo then gathers at the table and says, we decided that we split in multiple parties. So they orchestrate the Soviet Union fall apart into multiple, because nobody wanted to do that. So probably the conclusion of my presentation is that, yes, the Politburo, the chief staff of the Soviet Union, really thought of a peaceful reform through language, through discourse, through imagination, through introduction of political sciences, non-Marxist political sciences, but still they encountered real resistance from the masses. So they still were not able to do it peacefully, and they had to do it top-down, as everything else. And it worked out. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Serhii, for this amazing presentation and interesting topic. But I think, like myself, all of us have probably a lot of questions, so we will be happy to have a few minutes for that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Serhii. I very much enjoyed the slide presentation and the content. In the past, when I go to literature, culture, or presentation, somebody reading the paper. Yeah. So this is very different. It's very engaging. I have a couple of questions. The first is regarding the method that you mentioned you used originally, but had to change it as part of this humanity. So I'm curious about that. Another question is, what is the legacy of that body of literature today, post-Soviet era? And third one, if you have time, is I'm very surprised that in 1984, the Political Bureau said Marxism-Leninism was outdated. Nobody told Albania, nobody told the rest of the world that the Soviets were thinking this is outdated. I didn't know that. I didn't know that in 1984 they were thinking Marxism-Leninism was outdated. So it was very illuminating. But great job.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lotfi. So I'll try to get back to the question of the method. And once again, here I'm reiterating McLuhan, right? That medium is the message, methodology is the message. The way we approach certain problem will show different sides. You know, I had the choice not only in terms of whether it's statistical analysis or a traditional keyword analysis for literary studies, but also whether it's going to combine political science, whether it's going to combine archetype analysis. And I went through these different stages, iterations for years. And just because restrictions were introduced constantly for me, right? Like, okay, now cut this off and cut this off. I would say in a rather non-perestroika way. So, like, you know, I was just told, you know, no digital humanities, get it out. No political science, get it out. Like, no materialism, get it out. Yeah, and that's that. Yeah. So I ended with discourse analysis as the method that worked for different fields, and at the same time satisfied my committee, right? So basically what I'm saying is that there was dimension, right, of field, right, the field. And the field was defined very strictly, that it must be literary sciences with literary methodologies. I could have applied these methodologies to digital humanities, but they were also kind of tokened out, let's say. I really want to publish my final book, and I propose this kind of as my book proposal, is that it is a digital humanities study, because these words are not Russian. And I want to show how they circulated, where they appeared, and how they circulated in printing overall, not only in science fiction, because science fiction is where they circulated the most. Because, for instance, in the Soviet Union, nobody could speak about pluralism, right? Oh, and legacy of this works, right, I'll just quickly say that the state, the Russian state, tries to counteract this legacy by emphasizing a very specific narrative in science fiction, a science fiction of a colonist who comes to this parallel universe, and this parallel universe is always hell. So, but this is a way to narrow, right, the entire legacy into this kind of one trope. Someone superior. Yes, please.
Thank you for your beautiful lecture. My curiosity was, you were talking about Orwell's 1984 and Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit. And if I understood well, you specified that these were the tools by which a certain political and ideological intelligentsia was trying to demystify or to debunk the Marxist monolithic ideology. But what about, and you quoted the masses, what about the masses? Did they read Western science fiction? And if they did, how did they perceive it? because no, Bradbury and Otto Orwell are the critique of the capitalist society in a certain sense. So how did that impact if there were common readers? I mean, middle class readers of this side. Were they translated?
Yes, thank you so much. This is a very relevant question. And actually, a lot of the texts that talk about pluralism are introductions written for foreign science fiction by these Politburo members.
Yeah.
Right? So every foreign text comes with an introduction where it's shamed for its ideology, where it's shown that they live in the world of fatalism. They don't believe in future. It's a must. But that's the place where subversion happens too. That's where Shakhnazarov and Arabogli introduce these writers as, actually they have an insight into political science.
Serhii, thank you for that presentation. I have many questions. There are many startling points along your analysis. I was also startled about the idea that Marxist-Leninism could be declared outdated before Perestroika, just on the very eve of Perestroika. But my first question is related to Olympia's observation about pluralism, perhaps, and that is that as Perestroika proceeds and tests the waters, tests the receptivity of Soviet society to the idea of pluralism, what happens to the legitimacy of the imprisonment of political dissidents? Because it seems that it would be undermined all but immediately. And we're all familiar with the drama of Sakharov's being liberated from Nizhny Novgorod. And that was a tremendous political statement. But as far as I remember, there was no mass release and amnesty for all of the other political dissidents who were continuously imprisoned and in camps during this late Soviet, early pluralist discourse. What happened with that? Does that question make sense?
Absolutely, thank you so much. So the thing is, with Gorbachev, as I said, he is a KGB disciple, and he...
He's Andropov's protege. There's every reason for him to come on.
Yeah, and he continues the same politics. So in one way, he says, okay, we have freedom, but at the same time, he runs tanks over protesters in Tbilisi, Vilnius, and he represses the revolution in Kiev, Ukraine. So they say one thing, they do the other thing. They say, now we will tell you everything, and then Chernobyl explodes, and they don't say it, right? And they let everybody go and just walk in the street and die out of cancer, right? I think it's just inscribed in their political power that they confuse if they cannot terrorize and shame, right? So they just run on confusion. And that's why they didn't release, political opponents, because the people who were in power were the same people. That was the problem. So what I wanted to show was this reform. That these terms have to be trashed. They have to be gone, right? And same way people have to be gone. If they're not gone, the change really is not fulfilled, right? That's why a lot of people stayed in jail, right? Because they were jailed by the same people who stayed in power. And one more thing, historical thing, is that once the Soviet Union collapsed and the KGB tried to reinstate the government, they arrested Gorbachev in Yalta, where the post-World War II peace was signed. And they said that he's sick, he's going to die soon, so the KGB will govern, and it failed, right? They put tanks in every city, still didn't work. And after that, the Red Directors, those people who were still in power, controlling the factories, instead of doing what the government told them to do, to give shares to people, to reform their system of power, what did they do? They trashed everything they produced. They stored it in such a way that they were not accessible to the market, to show that you want freedom, then you'll have hunger. That's just the historical proof that there was no replacement of the staff, so they fought against these reforms. And that's why, the political prisoners were not released during the Stalinization.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question. Thank you, Serhii. My question is, what is
the legacy of science fiction today? It places the same kind of role, creating kind of new developments of how to change things, because unfortunately I'm not an expert, but I'm seeing like a regression, no? After what happened with Russia, eventually, everybody was kind of hoping that things seems to be closer to that period more than far from that period. So if you have an idea how this is working.
Thank you, Luis. So the White House experts, they try to promote, again, the space race narrative.
Yeah.
It's a science fiction narrative. That's why, the book Orbital, I forgot who's the author, about the Russians and the Americans in space, trying to negotiate questions, is a current bestseller, like promoted bestseller, exactly because only science fiction can give us hope that the change is possible. Because the politics themselves, they claim that history stopped, the problems will be always the same. You turn on TV, you get the message that we live in the worst times, but since we are all researchers, we can go to YouTube and turn on news from 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago. I'm a very young person, but what surprises me is that it's almost like I'm watching the same news. The same territories, the same problems, the same narrative, that it's new, like it was advertisement, right? So it kind of, probably what science fiction gives us is that we now can return to nostalgic past with science fiction, and maybe it's going to be the common language between the countries. Right, so this legacy is that we work with the mainstream language that has its legacy in political terms. The people who are still alive have it somewhere programmed, right? Everybody knows about Terminator. Everybody knows about alternative worlds. So these are really easy tropes to use. They no longer look really exceptional, but they can be introduced to younger generations to kind of let's say, tune in these new generations to that conversation that happened 30 years ago, and still can go on in the same language. Yeah? Because Western pluralism still remains the same. Right? So yeah, it's a common language that we need to try to speak because it's very mainstream.
Thank you very much again. So another for coming, and I hope I see you in our next event. And have a wonderful weekend. We have some sunny day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis.
It was very nice. Yeah.
You knew that they thought much